welcome to Unstress. My name is Dr Ron Ehrlich. Now, we've covered the issue of regenerative agriculture and its importance, not just in terms of carbon sequestration, in terms of regeneration, the giveaway is in the name, rather than sustainability. Sustainability of a degraded situation is one thing, but regeneration is another, and it turns out that regenerative agriculture has so many benefits in terms of making healthy soils to grow healthy food and healthy animals on. Today we are going to be exploring a new and collaborative effort coming from a group called Farmers Footprint. I love the concept behind this organisation, and today we're going to be talking to its CEO, David Leon. Look, I'm not going to give anything away. I hope you enjoy this conversation I had with David Leon. Welcome to the show, David.
Thanks for having me, Ron. Appreciate it.
David, regenerative agriculture is a favourite topic of this podcast. And Farmers Footprint is something that I've been looking at and reading about, and it's just such a fascinating and empowering group. I wondered if you might share with our listener a little bit about Farmers Footprint and how it came to be.
Sure. Yeah. Thank you. Well, Farmers Footprint, we're a nonprofit based in the United States. We launched back in February of 2019, so we're a young organization. And I co-founded that organization with a very dear friend of mine named Dr. Zach Bush. And we really started this organization with a film, with a story. And this story, was a farm family in the U.S. that was on the vanguard of what we now understand to be a regenerative transition in the way that they operate and steward their land. It is a human and poetic story more than anything else, because our number one goal with telling this story was to create relationship and connection. And that's what, I would come to understand to be really at the foundation of what regenerative agriculture is, which really is a relationship, a collaboration with one's land, with one's community, and with one's family. And this film didn't start in that way. It started, actually, Zach wanted to tell a story about glyphosate travel through the Mississippi River system, it's the largest river system in the United States. And he wanted to take measurements up and down, and they traveled from the north to the south. Where he was interested in that was really in what we call Cancer Alley, which was this collection of chronic cancer cases happening in the southeast of the United States at the outlet of that river system into the Gulf of Mexico. And the intent of that story changed a little bit when we actually started meeting the farm families that were living and working alongside that river system. And it changed. We changed the focus into we really want to show the struggles and transformations that were happening in U.S. agriculture, because farmers, more than anyone, are starting to understand that there was something incredibly wrong, and it wasn't necessarily all the science that was telling that story in the most efficient way. It was a story about relationship and one's understanding of health outcomes that they were seeing within their own families and in their own communities. And that was the first takeoff point that something was very wrong here. And so what Farmers Footprint then, intended to do was, following the model of a doctor stepping across sector lines into food production and agriculture, starting to ask very specific questions about how food production was affecting health outcomes in the patients that Zach was treating. that was really what brought this story to life for so many people. It shifted from a soil science story to a human health story and a relationship story of the intrinsic connection between the microbiome in the soil and the microbiome of the human body. And so that, in retrospect, as we shared that film online, even without really the strategic intention to launch a nonprofit around it, we realized quickly that we had an important role to play and a platform to utilize in order to strengthen the tenets of that story. And it was because human health came into the picture all of a sudden. This is why you have to care about your food and the way that it is produced and the way that we are operating our land, because it is having very real consequences, not just for the ecology of that land, but for human health in general. And that's where we saw things really start to take off. So Farmer's Footprint, coming out of that, we didn't really know all that was happening at the time as we were going through it. We were watching this story get written, so I'm sharing retroactively here how we came to that. But what we realized was a big part of our theory of change was the power of story. That we had perhaps one of the most important stories of this generation unfolding on farms and within food systems in rural communities around the country, and as we would come to see around the globe, and that we needed to tell a cohesive narrative about those emergent themes that were coming out, so that we can expand really the good that has been established on the ground. There's a lot of organizations and farmers, indigenous folks who have been practicing what we now broadly call regenerative agriculture and promoting its principles. But there just has not been a platform to raise those up through the noise. And so, that's what we want to use our platform to do, is amplify those groups, be a source of connectivity between folks who are looking for the resources, and connectivity with one another, because so much of, again, regen ag is this relationship with community, and there is no, we understood, later on as well, there is no silver bullet for just saying, if we put this in place, that this will solve, the deficits or barriers across all these different regions. Regenerative agriculture is it's highly distributed and it's highly regionalized, and so how can we get farmers, food companies, producers, processors, educators, how do we get them talking within a regional context? And that's a very different sort of strategy than typically capitalism likes to impose, which is go vertical, go big, and go really scalable. This is a very complex problem because it is so distributed. And so we thought that, the best way to address something complex is make it simple. And that's what you do in a story, is you relate something that may be very, very complex into a very simple and relatable way. And that's really what we do.
Yeah, well, it's just, there's so much there that you've said that is so powerful and so profound. I mean, that whole thing about relationship and connection, not just between individuals and communities, but between us and the ground that we grow our food in, is so powerful. And of course, the power of story, which has been going on for tens of thousands of years, even before we could write. So we instinctively react well to this storytelling. And the farmer's story is such an interesting one, isn't it? Because farmers are producing the food we need to be healthy, but farmers themselves aren't always the healthiest of people because of the very nature of the work they do and the stresses they are under, isn't it? I mean, that's part of the paradox here, or the dilemma, really, isn't it? That the farmer's own health in this process is not as good as it could or should be.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, it's the unfortunate truth that at least in the United States, there's food deserts in the midst of communities that are almost nothing but farms. And you go, how is that possible? And it is just, that's a complex question in itself. But the crux of it is that we've created these huge complex supply chains that sort of roll up and consolidate and make best use of this asset here and this asset there. And it ends up, what ends up happening is you leave out the rights and needs of the communities themselves. And so if your county is growing just acres and acres and acres of soybeans, that's not actually food for a whole lot of folks. And in fact, your whole county might be only growing things that are going into animal feed. And that's the unfortunate truth. And that's where farmers have had to sort of shift to those realities because of the market pressures at play. And what got left out at the end was the health and resiliency and diversity of their own communities, their diets, and how that was affecting their health. So it's a huge problem, and that was another one of the light bulbs that I think has come on for a lot of farmers was, there wasn't a lot of doctors going to a farmer and saying, the way that you are growing your food is directly affecting the health outcomes of my patients. And that's a powerful, powerful thing for a farmer to hear. That reframed their work in ways that they had never thought about before in many cases. And so that really is demonstrative of the power of story. That is actually a reframing. That is a making a metaphor of something that you do and seeing it in a brand new light, so that it has a profound twist in the way that you understand what you do. So yeah, we've seen that over and over again, not just with farmers, but all the way up the supply chain, and certainly with consumers as well. Regenerative agriculture sort of forces us to unthink some of the pillars that we associate with how our society is constructed, and we're starting to rethink what those actually are and what they look like.
It's interesting because part of what we look at in our podcast is also how we think about things is a very important aspect to our health. And there's this concept called the PERMA model, which is PERMA, which is being positive, engaging, relationships, having meaning, and being acknowledged. That's the PERMA of PERMA. And when we look at farming and the purpose of growing food, if it is just a balance sheet issue of survival for the individual, then that kind of is very restrictive. And if you are trying to dominate nature in that endeavour rather than enable it, that is also kind of restrictive. It's interesting, isn't it? The resistance. I mean, I've been very interested as a health practitioner about regenerative agriculture and its ability to provide nutrient-dense foods. But one of the funniest or the most difficult thing I've found is when you have a regenerative farmer on the one side of the road and the traditional farmer on the other side of the road, and the farms look so different, and the attitude of the farmer and their dependency on the chemical industry, the finance industry, that there's literally, I've been in farms where it's side by side, it couldn't be more contrasting. You think about what is the restriction there for the farmer on the other side of the road to accept what's going on in the regenerative farm. And it's such an interesting situation there, isn't it? I mean, what do you make of that?
Well, it's I came to this work not as a farmer. I'm not a farmer, and so I usually need to sort of caveat all my conversations with farmers. I lead off with that, and we can get into why that ended up being sort of more of a blessing than anything else. But one piece of it is that I underestimated the extent to which a farmer's identity is wrapped up in the way that they are operating their land.
Mm.
That was an entirely foreign concept to me, and that's sort of what explains these things. Is there's a whole host of different sort of metrics and components that a farmer is considering when they make a sort of change like that. And certainly, we think of it, sometimes in terms of just being economic, and oftentimes it certainly is. But you have to remember too that a lot of cases, these farms, this is land that their family has been on for generations, and there's a pride there. Certainly, there's an anxiety there about what is to come, and what are the changes that I'm making, and how is that going to affect the legacy of my family and its relationship to the land that I'm on. So it's one of the most complex pieces of this whole equation, and we spend a lot of time, as storytellers certainly, but even more widely in the regen space with other nonprofits and folks who work in this space, thinking about what is driving those behavior changes. And unfortunately, what we've seen for the most part is that farmers need to be almost at they need to be facing existential collapse in their business and access to their land for them to make the dramatic changes that may be necessary to bring it back. And so a big part of our work is like, what are the ways that we can intervene before they are on the very last thread of solvency, and those are still open questions. There's certainly been approaches that have worked, and other times it just surprises you in ways that you can't imagine. I'll give you one quick example. Actually, one of them that's interesting is like a farmer had told me, well, the way that's really convincing to me is did my neighbor end up buying that brand new truck out the back? And it's like, that was one of those things. It's not like they're trading profit margin or anything, but there's subtle markers like that of going, okay, like he must be doing something right. He was able to get a new truck this year. And so it's tapping into those subtle hints that there are markers and things that farmers are looking for that may not be immediately apparent.
But you're right, because in many of the stories that I've heard, it's often been some crisis, some trauma.
Right.
That has driven the change. And hey, on an individual level, we hear that all the time when people get diagnoses of cancer, say. People sometimes have reflected on it was the best thing that ever happened to me. I mean, I know we would all rather not, but that's an interesting way of framing a trauma. And it's interesting, the resistance to change, because sometimes it's that switch that, am I going to explore change, that is the first step. And for so many people, particularly that have been connected with the land over generation after generation, change implies a rejection of the past. And that is what is so difficult in the process. And I think it's a way of reframing that concept to say, no, it's not. It's not a rejection of the past. In fact, it's a building from the past for the future. And that attitudinal change almost gives permission to think, okay, this is the way it has been done, and now moving forward, how do I move forward in that? But it's your journey, David, that I'm also interested. I mean, I want to talk more about, because there's so much there you said about Farmer's Footprint that I wanted to dive into. But your background, your own personal journey, I know you're not a farmer, and I know you've come to this relatively recently, and your background is very different from that, and yet here you are, CEO of a not-for-profit organisation called Farmer's Footprint. Tell us a little bit about that journey.
Yeah, I'm, in a lot of ways, I think my journey is emblematic of what I'd like to see, or what I envision for much of our audience to go on. And that is, where have you come from? Where does the world need to go? And what are the unique gifts that you can bestow given your background, experience, and who you are? And that's what regenerative ag or that's what regeneration in general is really calling for, is diversity of voices, backgrounds, experiences to participate in the healing of the planet and our species. And so for me, just to, I don't have any illustrious pedigrees, or I mean, I've been an entrepreneur. I like to solve and work on interesting problems. I've had a CPG brand. I've had a
Go on, hang on.
technology company. Oh,
CPG.
sorry, consumer packaged goods.
Of course.
Yeah, I mean, I had it was a soap company actually that I ended up buying off of Craigslist. And we brought that into Walmart nationally, and I had a technology company that based around providing payments and scheduling for yoga teachers to sort of be their own studio. It's where I've come from. In many ways, I thought it had nothing to do with what I do now. And what I realized is, first you have to be ignited by a problem. And I had the benefit. Zach was my neighbor. I was good friends with his wife, Jen. And we had met through the yoga scene where we were living there in San Diego. And this guy comes along, and he's an interesting fellow. We have dinners and glass of wine and talk about the world and the way of things. And, at a time when I was about to make a transition in my career to exit out of a couple of my ventures and was ready to see what was next. And he called me up and said, "Hey, I'd like you to check out this story that we've been envisioning. And I think there might be something pretty big here, and tell me what you think." And I'd seen an early cut of the film, and I called him the next day and I said, I feel very strongly about this. This feels like something really, really big, and I don't know what I can give, but I'd like to give something. What I do know how to do is start and run early stage ventures. I'm comfortable with that sort of uncertainty, and I'm comfortable rolling up my sleeves and just getting in and doing it. And so that was the next step on my journey was, hey, you're going to run a nonprofit now. Let's go see what this is about. And what I then understood is the gifts are not just to extend to farmers. And obviously I was coming to them with a very open beginner's mind and asking a lot of stupid questions, and maybe hearing things in a way that, someone who's been working in the space for many decades, they can't hear it that way anymore. Mm-hmm. And I realized I'd like to take that journey that I was on and model that for as many people as possible, because that means we get a lot more stupid questions and we get a lot more beginners, and that is only a good thing. And so for me, especially, not just with the mission at hand with Farmers Footprint, was the nonprofit structure in general is really in need of rethinking the paradigm for how a nonprofit operates in the world. And so a big part of my work as well has been, what are the new ways that nonprofits can interact with for-profit companies? There's some special superpowers that each entity has, and it's not driven by profit. It's driven by mission, and that can be leveraged in really important ways. So I'd like to see, I looked around the room at my peers here as I was on this very steep learning curve coming up through Regen Ag, and I had some really important mentors, obviously, that brought me in and made sure I was listening to the right people and reading the right books. And I said, look, all these groups are doing amazing work. No one knows their story. They deprioritize and underinvest in their own marketing and increasing their own market share. And you have the resulting, sense of scarcity that really, is a cornerstone of nonprofits, unfortunately. And it shouldn't be. These are some of the most passionate, smart, driven folks I've ever worked with. And so a big part of my my next push into this, knowing that Farmers Footprint is not the singular org that is going to go and solve this problem, was to go, how do we raise everyone who's doing this work up? And part of that is a very startup problem of, we need to create better business models within nonprofit. We need to understand that you have to be solvent. You have to be attracting interest in the work that you're doing. You have to be able to tell a story about yourself. So just as we're telling stories about farmers and amplifying the work that they're doing, we also tell stories about the organizations that are supporting them and giving them the microphone, so to speak, so that they can drive in the support and resources that they need to continue and expand that work. So that's as much a part of what we do at Farmers Footprint as anything else.
Yeah, and it's interesting you mentioned the word diversity, because it is that diverse group of skills and perspectives, and also from a novice's perspective in this area, asking those basic questions is actually a very cathartic experience for the person who is answering them, as well as the person that's listening to them. I think, the person who's answering your question, your basic farming question, is being asked to go back to that very basic level and perhaps even question it. It's interesting. And you bringing this other skill into, I'm actually rather passionate about this idea that not-for-profits have a very important role to play in bringing together both profits and not-for-profit organisations. Because what a novel idea, not making a profit and still doing some good, but in a coordinated way. I love that about Farmers Footprint. Yet you're sort of exploring in different regions. How are you bringing those organisations together? How's that been going? I love that idea. How has that been going?
Yeah, it's relationship building and network building. Some days it feels like everything happens within a week, and then sometimes you have weeks go by where you feel like nothing's happening. So it comes in fits and starts sometimes. But I think what I'm really excited about in that network building side is how much we all have to learn from one another. And so if we can create those points of connection, what we end up seeing is everyone's work gets accelerated. It's sort of like each neural connection, new connection that gets made, it lights up a whole other ecosystem of players within that space. And there's just so much. Australia, case in point, we had a lot of interest coming in from Australia, and in some ways, Australia is leaps and bounds ahead in terms of the willingness to take on and actually how far down the path many farmers already are in this work. And I've had the opportunity to have some amazing conversations about what is working there, and especially take the behavioral question first off, and you go, it doesn't. Sure, there's cultural differences here and there, but the core drivers of human behavior change, I would posit to say that they're actually not all that different between different countries around the world. And so it's just interesting when you have conversations with other folks working in spaces in different parts of the world, how they've gone about and addressed some of those behavior change questions. And I think there's just so much opportunity for shared learning, for peer-to-peer mentorship across country lines that is going to be entirely relevant for the speed at which we're able to make these transitions come to bear fruit. And so I think it's just incredibly important. I really don't turn down any phone call with anyone, because as outside as I use this example a lot because it's just been a really fun one. I fielded a call from an interior designer who's based in LA, who does sort of big projects for celebrities and stuff, and he was just very lit up by detoxifying our neighborhoods with the sorts of pesticides that municipalities were using. And as I'm asking him how he came into this journey, we get into this riff about how do we start to tell stories about regenerative agriculture and bring it into physical space. So I'm making multimedia and Instagram posts and written word, and have this whole tangent with this person who writes stories within physical space. And that may be where I spend 5% of my time today. It may be where 80% of our impact comes from, 3 years from now. And that's why it's so exciting. Every conversation is a new opening for a different sort of expertise to come and contribute and participate in this movement.
I know I've connected with some of the people that have been connecting with you in Australia, and you've also obviously in the US the movement is growing. Where else have you been able to connect with? Is Europe? Have you found a strong regenerative movement in Europe or in the UK?
Certainly, yeah. I've spoken to folks in the UK. Canada is a really big one. There's a lot of great work happening up there. And it's interesting too. This might be a bit anecdotal, but I've also seen sort of different regions tend to bring different sorts of priorities into the work. And so part of it obviously is agricultural, but it's so highly variable because of different climates and crops and soil type. The conversations I've tend to have in Europe have been around investors who really want to support these transitions and are really interested in ways to do that without, getting involved in greenwashing or sort of even traditional funding vehicles that might cut corners when they need to. And then, I'm talking to you today from Hawaii, which obviously is a state in the US, but has such a strong indigenous identity that sits alongside the state. And I got off a call with another partner in New Zealand similarly. And those are such valuable knowledge exports as well, because we talk a lot about internally the power of indigenous wisdom in powering, the regenerative movement. And that's because those were the inventors of it. It's native communities are the ones who had been most harmoniously, working with the land and nature, and they have a critical role to play in the way that this story gets told and the way that it's implemented. We have so much learning and listening to do there. So it's going to be interesting to start sharing those stories cross-culturally and across different countries. And I think what it's ultimately going to do is make us realize how relevant all of those differences really are. As different as it may seem from a cultural perspective, there's so much relevant information to learn and pull and utilize that it's really exciting for the way that we're approaching this, particularly in storytelling.
Well, the story of the film is a great one, and I know it's available on your website there, which we'll obviously have links to. And the connection, bringing these groups together. I mean, it would be great to in some way, particularly now as we're learning that Zoom is such a great way to connect with people, no matter where they are, when they, within reason where they are. Bringing these groups together is going to be a really big part of the issue, isn't it? Literally, it's getting them talking.
Yes, yeah, it's so fascinating, actually. For the apparent slowdown that the pandemic has caused, it's really accelerated connection in a lot of ways because we're actually communicating so much more efficiently right now. It sort of dawned on us as a team. We had a couple months back, right at the start, when everyone started working from home, we did a panel discussion with a few big regenerative thinkers, and Zach was on there, and a big big consumer company in the U.S. had their CEO on there, and we assembled this group in Zoom, and 6,000 registrants came in to witness that. And we got off that call, which I took from my living room floor. I was sitting on the floor with my computer on the table, and we got off, and we just said, we just had a whole regenerative conference for about an hour and a half. No planes, no hotel ballrooms, no crappy airport food. And it was a couple $100 extra on our Zoom account. And so, it really is it makes you think about, wow, we were wasting a lot of time going to and fro face to face. And yeah, for the sliver of time, that's going to be really important to get that real face time in. But in so many ways, it has accelerated our ability to do our work. People are leaning in as we are now, face to face to a screen. I can see your house and a little slice of your life, and you can see a little of mine, and that is connection. There is connection there for sure. And so, yeah.
The thing I also liked about the message coming out of the Farmer's Footprint too is, and we've heard it so many times, but act locally and think globally. And this idea of taking the best of local knowledge and local practice and sharing that globally, but actually doing it locally is a really important part of this message, isn't it? And I guess this whole story about connecting with people via Zoom is all good and well, but we've also come to realise how precious that face-to-face contact is, and that's available in our local communities. So I'm kind of, right. I love what you got. I love what you're doing, David. I love the whole story of the Farmer's Footprint. So listen, we're going to have links to the website and the film, which I would highly recommend to anybody who is interested in their health, the health of the individual and the planet, because they're all connected. And certainly getting this message out to farming communities and how to connect city communities with that as well is just terrific. I really think what you're doing is fabulous, and I look forward to hopefully working more closely with you and helping collaborate that movement in Australia.
Very grateful for your support and for sharing your platform today with me. The film is free. We've got pieces starting up in Australia, so we're hoping that there's going to be a more direct way for all of your listeners to get involved. And I would just say too, my call to action is call out to me. I will have a conversation with each and every one of you. I want to hear how you came to care about this movement and work, and ultimately understand, what you can give and how you can participate with the knowledge and expertise that you have. It's so important, and it is so needed.
David, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Ron. It was a pleasure. Thank you.
So there it is, Farmer's Footprint. Well, the idea of bringing groups together, the idea of building relationships and connections, and harnessing the local communities, the local strengths within those areas and those regions, and bringing them together in conversation and sharing knowledge is something that I found so empowering. The film is a great film. It's only 20 minutes or so long, but it tells a really important story. And I think David's point about the power of story is one that we as a species are always attracted to, and there are just so many great stories. Now, I've spoken over the last couple of years to some tremendous people in the regenerative agriculture space. Of course, Alan Savory, who talks about the importance of a holistic context underpinning every decision that is made, whether it's made as a government, as a corporation, as a family, as an individual, to have an overarching holistic view of how decisions will impact on individual, community, and planetary health, and have that as the holistic context of every decision that's made, and then go on and sort out the details. Alan Savory, a legend. Go back and listen to that podcast. It's even more relevant today than, that it was then, it was relevant then too. And of course, talking to some wonderful people in the ag space, Terry McCosker, Charlie Massey, Graham Reese, Charlie Arnott. So just to name a few, and we connected with that IPEC group, the International Panel of Experts in Europe. So there's so many great episodes in this, and this adds another pillar to that resource, which is a big passion of this podcast. And I think it's something that we should all need to be connected with. If you think the food you eat is important, and obviously it is, then how it is grown is also is the important part of that, and how not just sustainable, but how regenerative. I love the way Charlie Massey talked about the fact that sustainable isn't necessarily good enough. If we have a degraded environment, sustaining that is not necessarily what we want. What we want to be doing is regenerating. And, when you think about the fact that soil takes 500 years, I think it is, to grow 1 inch of soil out there in nature, and yet within a regenerative agricultural environment, you can grow 1 inch or 2.5 centimetres of soil in 3 to 5 years. Now, I found that fact incredible. And the fact that soil degradation is such a huge and growing and constant problem. So much here, and it was, when I heard about Farmers Footprint, it was so great to connect with them. Now, also don't forget the Unstress with Dr Ron Ehrlich app. We've upgraded that as we have our new website, and we've got some great courses coming online in the next few weeks and months. So stay tuned for all of that. So, and of course, don't forget, leave a review on iTunes and help push the ratings up. I hope this finds you well during these very challenging times. Until next time, this is Dr. Ron Ehrlich. Be well. This podcast provides general information and discussion about medicine, health, and related subjects. The content is not intended and should not be construed as medical advice or as a substitute for care by a qualified medical practitioner. If you or any other person has a medical concern, he or she should consult with an appropriately qualified medical practitioner. Guests who speak in this podcast express their own opinions, experiences, and conclusions.